going in, then the lead auditor will be the point of contact. They will be the ones that are managing the audit, and they will introduce you to the co-auditors, and they will make it clear as to who does what in this whole audit process. Okay, so Claire's just said there's a recording available. I'm sorry about that. And finally, consultants. Now, this is an interesting area. TAC are very clear about how they see the role of a consultant, what they see the role of a consultant is during an audit process. Basically, if you've had somebody help you, say, set up your RTO for an initial audit, or if you're re-registering and you've had somebody in to help you get ready for the re-registration process, then that's fine, but they should not be taking an active role in the audit process. They should not be communicating directly with the auditor, because we want to see it's what you are doing, that you know what you're doing, not that you've been told to do something by an external individual who will walk away and you won't actually then have anybody to assist you. The one exception is when a consultant is actually embedded in your RTO and you can clearly demonstrate that you have an ongoing relationship with that consultant, that they advise you on a regular basis, they help you with internal audits, that they are really part of your team. But generally speaking, consultants don't have a part to play in the actual audit process. ASQA, funnily enough, are not quite as rigid, but they still really want to, as an ASQA auditor, when I go in, I still want to be sure that it's the RTO that's telling me how they're going to run their organisation, and the people in the RTO that are telling me how they're going to run their organisation, not the consultant. And if they have been used, then a consultant should be tailoring their documentation and their information to the particular RTO they're supporting. One size does not fit all. Okay. Right. Okay. So, audit. You've been either the time has come within your organisation's cycle that you need to redo your registration, or you are extending your scope. So you want to have that there will be a requirement for your organisation to be audited. So really, obviously, the first thing that needs to be done is you need to talk to TAC in this case to identify the requirement for the audit, and then you will be contacted to schedule the audit. TAC is very good, it's very responsive. Sometimes, unfortunately, with ASQA, who is the national regulator, these scheduling an audit can actually take months. So those of you that are registered with TAC, be grateful. You will have all your audit in a timely fashion. And the scheduling of the audit is done in a way that it should be mutually convenient for both parties. Once an audit's been scheduled, and you will be then notified of who the auditor is going to be, and you've got to declare, as well as the auditor has to declare, if there are any conflicts of interest. So what that really means is, have they perhaps been a consultant for you in the last 6 months? I have one recently. I've been supporting what is now North Regional TAFE for many years, and they wanted me to do an audit for North Regional TAFE, and I had to say, sorry, they're my client. And so they and I had to say no, very much as Michaela can't do that particular audit. You can't just say, oh, I don't want that particular auditor because I don't like her or him. You've actually got to give a reason for it, and it's usually that you've had some prior relationship with that individual. What doesn't count as a conflict of interest is, say, for example, I'm delivering this particular webinar. I do lots of other presentations and things at open forums, and that does not mean you can't have me as an auditor, because I'm giving generic information that is not tailored specifically to your organisation. So if an auditor that's on the list from TAC is giving general information that's available to everybody, then you can have them as an auditor. Generally, people who, most people are happy to get a date for their audit, and it's all fine and dandy. But then obviously emergencies happen. Auditors get sick and we have to reschedule, or you have a crisis and it has to be cancelled. But do be aware, while they will try and accommodate you as much as possible, TAC can only be as so flexible, and if you end up cancelling your audit, you will actually end up having to pay for it. So just be very careful if that does, if the need arises, or don't schedule an audit until you're really ready to participate. So I did talk about private residence audits, and basically what that means is that TAC insists that the auditors take along an observer. Interestingly enough, ASQA don't require that. We fill out a risk assessment, but really it makes, it's not very, it's not as reassuring as taking somebody else along, because sometimes it is a bit weird to be sat in somebody else's home office. But anyway, it's done because not every RTO is the same, and actually it makes a lot of sense for some providers to work from home office. Why should they have premises that they don't use unless, when they're perhaps training at their clients' premises, etc. Once the audit's been scheduled, once the scope of registration's been determined, the auditor will ask for some information from you. For something like a change of scope audit, or amendment to scope audit, there's a pretty standard list of evidence that you need to provide, which actually is in the information on the TAC website. But if it's something like an initial audit or re-registration audit, the auditor will say, look, can you send me this sort of information? And particularly what I usually ask for is the training and assessment strategy for any of the qualifications I'm going to look at, so I can then select which units of competency I'm going to focus in on that audit. So there will be a request for information, and depending on whether it's a desktop audit or a site visit, you will have an opportunity to submit that information electronically, generally speaking, or if you really want to do a hard copy, that's fine. And but it doesn't mean that other information won't be requested actually at the site audit. And the very first step for the auditor is then to review that information that's been provided up front. Okay, so if you've got your audit request in, you've been given a date for your audit, and you're going to TAC has informed you that you're going to have a desktop audit. So as I say, generally speaking, this is for amendments to scope. So they will send you a list of information to be submitted, and you can send those directly to TAC. And I would strongly suggest that you clearly identify what information you have provided. I usually suggest some sort of table and some sort of index to show what documents you've actually sent and what standards you think they refer to, because electronic documentation does go missing or doesn't seem to upload correctly. All sorts of wonderful reasons why the little IT gremlins seem to get in there and do their worst to make this as complicated a process as possible. So make sure you send in the evidence. Now, don't just rely on the list that's provided on the guide to your registration process, or the extension to scope process. Think about the clauses and standards that are going to be reviewed. So generally speaking, with something like a desktop audit for a extension to scope where you want to add another qualification or unit of competency, think about it. So you're going to be looking at most of the standards, most of the clauses in standard 1. So you need all your training and assessment materials. You need all the evidence behind how you've made the decision about the training you're going to be delivering. You need to provide clear indications of who's going to be doing the training and what their qualifications are and how they meet the standards. And with TAC, you will also be asked to provide evidence about your validation process. Now look at the clauses and think, what evidence do I really need to demonstrate that? Don't just rely on what's been specified in the list that TAC provides you, because there is, strictly speaking, an auditor doesn't have to go back and ask for additional evidence on a desktop audit. But do make the auditor's life a bit easier by actually saying or listing the evidence that you're providing. Okay. Right. So, however, preparing for a site audit is a bit more complicated. So that is quite a big audit. It generally takes a day or so, depending on the size of your organisation. So it is quite a task to prepare for a site audit. If you look in the handbook that's been provided, there are a couple of flowcharts that talk about what happens in a desktop and a site audit, and that may help you to give you some idea of, the timeframes and exactly how the whole process occurs. So whether it's initial registration or re-registration, you will have submitted some evidence, and the auditor will have a quick look at those things, and then decide from there what how they want to do the site audit, and whether they want to do any gather any follow-up evidence before they come to the site audit. So the most important thing is to be ready for your site audit. Make sure you have compiled the evidence that you think the audit is going to need and that it's readily available. One of the best ways of doing that is doing a bit of a self-assessment. There are a number of self-assessment tools around. Look at the different clauses and standards that you're going to be audited against, and think, what evidence can I provide to support or demonstrate my compliance against those clauses and standards. Make sure you have your audit team ready and that they know exactly what is going to be happening. It's really important. Try and have one point of contact for your audit, so that the auditor knows exactly who to contact and who to liaise with if they need information. Talk to your staff about what's going to happen at the audit. Tell them, how you want them to approach their dealings with the auditor. But do try and put people's minds at ease. We're not trying to catch you out, as I've said before. Excuse me. Sorry, I didn't want to cough in your ears. Sorry, there's a question there. Upon submission of a re-registration application 4 months prior to the expiry of registration, what is the approximate time frame for the site audit? Generally speaking, TAC are pretty swift on scheduling the site audit. It also depends on the time of year, but if you've put in your application already, and it's 4 months prior to the expiry of registration, I would expect to see the audit happen pretty quickly, because you've got to allow the 20 days for rectification, etc., etc. So the time frames that are on that flow chart will indicate that it does take 2 or 3 months for a whole audit process to go from where to go. So they would probably schedule the site audit pretty smartish. ASQA, as I say, have got a massive backlog in certain areas, and you will find that quite often they are I'm finding that they will extend the registration period because they're just not getting to the RTOs. Of course, for something like re-registration, again, more and more organisations are not being audited, which is good, bad. Less so with TAC, thank goodness, but with ASQA, sometimes they just go through to the gate. Does the auditor take into consideration previous audit history for the organisation and industry area prior to the audit? It's an interesting one. We always used to get for TAC, we always used to get the previous audit reports and things, and I'm not 100% sure why, but we don't seem to get that anymore. I know ASQA provide that intelligence to the auditors, but generally speaking, it shouldn't colour what the issues are, unless it's something like a monitoring audit, where obviously there have been issues in the past, and it's really important that the auditor sees and checks that you actually have done what you said you were going to do in terms of rectification. So yeah, it's kind of a case by case basis, but it really is. Again, I think that's very much determined by TAC or ASQA staff as to how that affects the risk profile of that particular audit process. But generally, if you've had issues, I would say that you probably are deemed a slightly higher risk organisation, which sometimes is a bit unfair, but it just makes you more aware of how you should approach the audit process yourself, and what areas you need to focus on. Okay, so prepare your staff. Sorry. Allocate somebody who is going to be able to assist the auditor, maybe take them around the organisation, particularly if it's a large organisation or you've got big workspaces, then make sure somebody is actually responsible for looking after the auditor. Make sure, sorry, excuse me, I'm just going to suck a lolly to stop me coughing. Also, make sure that you give the auditor all the information that they need about practical things like parking, where they are, if they are going to have to go to a couple of sites, what other information that they might need, and also make sure that you give them a really good workspace to be able to set themselves up with their computers, and be able to do a private area to do any interviews that they might want to do with students or staff. So just make sure that you're ready for that particular auditor to arrive. So the other thing when you're talking to your staff is, do make sure that you reiterate that they've really got to be upfront and honest with the auditor. The reality is, I don't know what it is about auditors, but if there's a chink in your armour somewhere, we tend to find it. Not because we're trying to catch you out, but it just seems to come to the fore. So make sure that your staff are really prepared to be honest and open with the auditors. And as far as I'm concerned, audits always go better with lots of good coffee. It's not bribery and corruption, honestly. But yeah, no, just make sure that you have some, just refreshments and things for the auditor as well during the day, because it can be quite a long day. So I suppose when you're in thinking about preparing for the site audit, the really important thing is to take the attitude that it's not an adversarial process, that you want to be able to allow the auditor to see your organisation in the best light you can, and that's really the best way of doing that is to be open and honest and make sure that your staff are prepared and that you are prepared. Again, there's some great information out there provided by TAC and ASQA. There's fact sheets that have been added, the standards for RTOs 2015. Be really familiar with those standards. There's the user guide, which is there's one produced by TAC, and there's the other one which is produced by ASQA. And make sure you're really familiar with your training package information, including the companion volumes. Okay, so I've looked at some of the questions that have been asked already. Any other questions at this point? This is kind of like the midpoint. I can't see anybody typing, so that's fine. Okay, I'll go on then. So what I'm going to be looking at next is actually what happens during the audit process. I'm not going to talk too much about desktop audit. That's pretty boring. I'm just sat here at my desk looking at your electronic information and writing up my audit report. But obviously it's the site visit which is the really the audit process, which is the most interesting and the one that you need to prepare for most. So, what happens during a site audit? So the auditor will have already had quite a bit of evidence from you, and they will have decided how they want to run the audit. And that will be described at the entry meeting, which is the beginning of the first day of the audit. Most audits are conducted over one day, but if it is a big RTO or you've got a huge scope of registration, it could be over a couple of days. But the entry meeting is where everybody's introduced, that you get to meet the audit team or the auditor if they're on their own, and it's the opportunity for the auditor to actually hear from you guys about your organisation. The auditor will go through what the purpose of the audit, so they'll reiterate the fact that it's a re-registration audit or it's an initial registration or whatever, and explain how that is affecting the scope of the audit. So which qualifications and units of competency are going to be looked at, particularly if you've got a large scope of registration. We can't look at everything. We sample. We tend to sample a couple of qualifications from each industry area, and for each qualification we sample 2 units of competency. So it really is, there's only a snapshot that we can take. They'll also talk about the standards that are going to be looked at, because some of the initial documentation that has been sent through may satisfy the requirements of a number of the standards and clauses, particularly things like complaints and appeals procedures. And when it comes to something like complaints and appeals, the number of organisations I go into that never have a complaint or appeal, so it's just a tick in the box exercise to make sure the process meets the requirement, and that's often done beforehand. Then we'll look at the schedule. If there is asked to be some visits to workshops, etc., we'll look at that, and also give some warning of any staff interviews or student interviews that might be conducted. There will also be an explanation of the possible findings of the audit, so that you're aware of what the outcome might be. We are, as auditors for TAC, but this doesn't apply for ASQA, encouraged to look for the strengths in an organisation. So if you're doing something particularly well, we also are encouraged to look for opportunities for improvement. I'll talk about that a little bit later on, but it's about, you're compliant, but there may be a few little things you could tweak to make it better. Obviously, there might be non-compliances. We'd love to do every audit and find everybody compliant, but that doesn't work necessarily. And then what will happen if there are non-compliances, and what you as an organisation will be given the opportunity to do to rectify those non-compliances. Do make sure that you remember to ask questions, to be engaged in the audit process. And the other thing that's really important is to make sure that you have somebody that's making notes about what the auditor is saying, so that you can go back and really clearly remember what was said at the time of the audit. Because sometimes it can get a bit overwhelming. It's a busy day. If you don't understand something, ask for clarification. That's what it's all about. It's got to be fair and transparent. So if you're not sure what's being asked for, don't second guess the auditor. Ask for them to tell you a little bit more about what they're actually looking for. And if you think something's not quite right, if an auditor's indicated that there wasn't sufficient evidence for certain parts of the audit, maybe you felt that there was the additional evidence that was provided and had been overlooked, don't be afraid to mention that to the auditor, because we're all human and we do forget things, or we do overlook things. So do challenge a finding if you think it's not quite accurate. Okay, so basically all the audit team will have been introduced, everything will have been discussed, and then at the entry meeting usually the auditor gives somebody in the organisation, generally the CEO or the boss, an opportunity just to give some background information about the RTO. That just puts everything in context, context makes people relax a little bit more and just is a good way of starting the day. And moving on to the main part of the audit process, which obviously is about collecting evidence. So make sure you've given the auditor enough space and room and privacy to allow them to look at the evidence that you're providing. The majority of the evidence that's going to be reviewed is going to be documentation. But they will include staff interviews. It will, if there are students around, include interviews with students. If not, then sometimes the auditor will do a follow-up on the telephone. And even sometimes there will be client interviews. So your target industry. So the evidence will be collected. The auditor will work through the systematically through the audit process and the scope of the audit and identify if there are any gaps in that evidence. And then she or he will then discuss with you where those gaps in evidence are, and you will have an opportunity to perhaps provide additional evidence for the auditor to look at, because it may have just been a document that's been overlooked, or the auditor can't see for looking. Sometimes you know that there's got to be something about fees in a particular document, and you overlook it. And sometimes it takes the author of the document to say no, it's definitely there. Most auditors allow for the fact that we don't see everything always the first time. But we will identify if there are any gaps, and you will be given an opportunity to fill those gaps. Okay, so when auditors are reviewing documents, they include staff or ask staff to give clarification if required. Yeah, they can do, and particularly if it's things to do with the training and assessment. Obviously, the best person to ask is the trainer and assessor. I'm looking at this particular assessment document. It appears to me that or you've determined that this individual was not yet competent, and yet I can't really see what your justification was, or vice versa. Or can you, I've got a broad outline of a lesson plan here, but can you give me a bit more detail about how you intend to conduct this training? So yes, that's exactly where the auditor will then want to talk to people about the evidence that's been found, because it's not always immediately obvious, and we all are guilty of drafting documentation which we think is as clear as crystal, and when somebody else reads it, you're going, I'm not sure I can follow the argument here. So we're not in there to do editing of your literary skills, excuse me, or your spellings or whatever, unless it impacts on the quality of the training. But yes, we will give people an opportunity to clarify. Oh, good. Thank goodness, Jane. Well done, Jane. Well done. Yeah, it's funny that, isn't it? Sometimes the browser will determine whether or not you can hear things. Okay, so you should always get an opportunity to address any gaps that the auditor's found, and if there are some non-compliances which are very easily rectified, I'm talking about things like NR, nationally recognised training logos in the wrong place, or you've missed your RTO number off a particular document. Those sorts of things can be easily rectified. The majority of the auditors will say, I'm going for lunch now. When I come back, let me have a look. And if you've updated your documents, that will be fine. They'll usually record that still in the audit report, but there is absolutely no point in making an organisation non-compliant if it's something really easy to rectify. So, again, it's not an adversarial process. We're not trying to catch you out. We are trying to give you every opportunity to demonstrate your compliance. So lots of different evidence. One of the questions I do get, I haven't had it here, but I do get occasionally, is how do you prove something that has not occurred? What I'm talking about here are things like complaints and appeals. How can I provide you evidence of my complaints and appeals that I've, how I've used the information complaints and appeals as required by some of the standards if I've not had a complaint and appeal? Yeah, we're not complete ogres. If you haven't done something You can't prove a negative. But in that instance, we look at your complaints and appeals procedures. We make sure that you have got that embedded in your continuous improvement process, and that you have a, if you did ever get a complaint and appeal, you know exactly how you would go about dealing with it. So yes, sometimes it's all very difficult to prove a negative, but it's we're not completely unreasonable individuals, honest, and we will try to give you every opportunity to just tell us what you would do in that situation. It's not quite the same as assessment in that situation, which is interesting. Okay. So all the audit's been conducted. You've had your feedback as you've been going along. You've been taking notes. Every opportunity has been provided to you to give the evidence, and then the audit concludes with an exit interview. Sorry, because I was thinking that if we interrupt, they might feel we're trying to give clarification or trying to save ourselves. Oh right, I get what you're saying. No. You have got the right to interrupt the auditor, to obviously not continuously so that they can't actually keep the chain of thought running, but you should have be self assured enough to participate in that audit process actively, and the more you participate and the more you get your point of view across, the better. Again, rules of evidence apply. So if an auditor does find a gap in the evidence or something that's not quite right, and you say, but yeah, we don't do that now, or there's other things, unless you've got something to support the fact that you've perhaps changed your processes, it's not really something that they can accept. But you can certainly, there should be a two-way conversation about anything that is not quite correct. And when you say something like save ourselves, you shouldn't really be having to save yourself at an audit. It's all about finding the information that's in there and allowing the auditor to make a really good judgment about what you're doing. And if the evidence that you're providing isn't really clear enough, then you should always have an opportunity to discuss it and provide further clarification. And an auditor shouldn't shut you down. Obviously, you can't go on and on and on and on. And somewhere along the line, the auditor's got to say enough. This often happens with trainer and assessor competency documentation. Oh, but I've got this document, I've got that document, or I've done this, I've done that. At the end of the day, somewhere along the line, a line has to be drawn. But generally speaking, you should be given every opportunity to clarify anything that you feel is not quite right. Okay, so all of that has been done. The auditor's gone away and sat in a huddle for a little while, or just looked at their notes and things, and prepared for the exit interview. And then the exit interview is something that it's really good to have most of the people that were involved in the audit participate in the exit interview, so that they can hear exactly what the auditor's got to say. So the exit interview is not the final decision. It is just an overview of the findings of the audit. So it's a general overview with and focusing on the specific clauses and standards that were reviewed, and it's some of those findings can be changed, because very occasionally I'll go back to my office, look at the evidence that I've gathered at audit, and I've realised that actually I did have the information there, I just overlooked it, or vice versa, that I thought I had the information, but when it came to it, I didn't actually have it. So generally speaking, it's a fairly broad overview of the outcomes of the audit. But there shouldn't be any surprises, because during the audit process you should have been given that feedback at all times, and that's why it's really worth taking notes during the audit process. So the auditor at this point in the exit interview can identify any strengths that they've seen in your organisation, if they've seen any opportunities for improvement. So if you're compliant, strictly compliant, but there's an opportunity to improve a little bit, they'll probably give you some guidance on that. And then finally, if there are areas of non-compliance, go over those areas, explain why the RTO is not compliant. While we can't tell you how to fix it, The other thing is you can do is make suggestions, and the auditor can say, yeah, that would be a good idea. If your training and assessment strategy isn't detailed enough to demonstrate quite clearly how the amount of training has been determined, then you could say, oh well, if I add this and this information in my strategy, would that be a good idea? And the auditor can say, yeah, that should probably clarify things. But they can't give you very, very specific advice. They can say, well, I've seen in other RTOs this has been used in a successful way, but nothing specific about what you need to do to rectify your non-compliances. The auditor will also give you a rundown on what happens after the audit, so the fact that you get the audit report, that you've got time to rectify, etc. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And as I say, if there are some very minor non-compliances that can be fixed almost straight away, and they're probably the only things that maybe make you non-compliant, that's often the auditor will give you that chance. But it will be recorded in the report and just said, this was a non-compliance, but evidence was provided immediately to rectify. The auditor won't give you anything in writing. That only happens through through TAC or from TAC. So it's really, really important you take notes during your audit. And that is really, really important for organisations who are registered with ASQA, because, at the moment I'm doing initial registrations for organisations, first of all, who applied in June last year and have just had an audit. And often those organisations will not get their audit report for 3 or 4 months. So, be aware, if you are regulated by TAC, they are much more timely, but it's still really important that you take notes so that you can start thinking of how to rectify any issues that may have been identified. Okay. Okay, so one of the main questions is, when it comes to auditing, is how much evidence do we need to provide? And that's one of these open-ended questions you can't give a real answer to. But it's usually, look at the evidence you're giving and does it ask yourself whether it addresses the requirements. Yeah, sometimes more is less if you drown the auditor in too much information, but generally speaking, don't overlook good documentation that you have, but also be very careful that you don't then end up with one document saying AB and the other one saying BC. Just be very careful. However, the other question is, how do we, how long should we keep the records for audits? TAC has got a bit of a guideline on this. It's a bit out of date, but it still gives you the gist of how you should approach your record management process. There is no one easy answer. I'll say that at the outset. And the way you can determine how you how long you keep your records for and what format, etc., is something that you, as an organisation, has to decide for yourself, and it's based on a number of things. So first of all, and it's on a hierarchy of requirements. So first of all, if you have a legislative requirement to keep records for 30 years or whatever, so for example, things like high-risk licenses, the evidence of competency has to be kept for 30 years. So it can be kept electronically, it doesn't have to be hard copy, but you do need to consider whatever that particular legislative requirement is, and that sits often above what is a requirement for your RTO status. So make sure you know what the requirements are for you. Then there are regulatory requirements. Again, they may be not just for an RTO, but it could be if you are a childcare or an organisation delivering childcare, or you've got first aid. There's all sorts of regulatory requirements that need you to keep records for beyond the statutory amount of time that generally you would consider for an audit. Then you've got some regulatory guidance that actually might come from TAC or other regulators. And generally speaking, my advice when it comes to audit evidence, particularly for assessments, is that you keep the latest assessments you've done over the last 6 months, and then you keep up to other assessments for up to 2 years. Keep samples. Apart from anything else, it's a good process if you are going to be considering doing validation and trying to validate audit assessment outcomes over time. So make some of these judgments depending on how, first of all, how many students you have as well. You know, if you're doing 1 or 2 day training and you're getting hundreds of students in, you probably don't need to keep your records for as long as, say, an organisation that delivers training that is over 2 years, and you've actually got to keep those records for the individual students for the whole time that they are registered and participating in training and assessment with you. So it's very much determined by your organisation's needs as well. And then you as an organisation may have your own policies. You know, these days with electronic format records, you can keep them forever. You just archive them and they're there forever. You don't have to have hard copy records unless there is some overarching requirement which goes beyond the need for what you have to evidence you have to provide for VET. Obviously, some audits are looking back over what you're doing, so re-registration audits and after 24 months audits are looking to see what you've been doing in the past, and that again it's the sort of thing that is worth considering about how you can demonstrate your compliance. And one of the things I do usually recommend is if you've got students who are borderline students, say for example they didn't fly through as competent straight away and you've had to go back and reassess, they're always the ones that are good to keep records of. Same with students who need support. It's really good to have a couple of audit records for student records for those sorts of individuals so you can demonstrate that you're actually doing the right thing by those students. Okay, where are we? Finally, after the audit, you will receive some sort of contact from the regulator. If you're fully compliant, you'll get a letter just saying well done and thank you very much, and they'll probably, if there are any opportunities for improvement, they'll identify those. You will get a report if it's a non-compliant audit. And then you will also get an opportunity to resubmit evidence. So if you get your audit report and you have got non-compliances, you will have what's a period of 20 days, 20 working days to rectify those any issues that have been found at the audit and identified in the audit report. You also have a timeline for if you want to dispute the audit findings or appeal or complain against the activities. So in terms of my timelines, so I come and do a site audit, I've got 7 working days to write up that audit report, which is fine if it's a small audit. If it's a big one, it's pushing it a bit. But I do have 10 working days to finalise a report from a desktop audit because I've got to just look at the electronic evidence. TAC will then send on the report to the organisation, and you will get 20 working days to respond to the any non-compliances that have been found. Normally, those responses go back to the auditor that did the audit, but that can't always be guaranteed. And then the auditor then has 10 working days to look at that additional evidence and make a final decision on whether you're compliant or not. In terms of audit outcomes, So in terms of the audit report, there are a number of sections in the audit report, and on page 18 of your handout, you'll actually see an example of the new format TAC Audit report. It's a bit of an unwieldy document these days, but it's got the basic information that you need to be able to look at. So the first section is about your organisation, the details of the audit, etc., etc., and the standards to be audited. The second section is about the scope of the audit, so which qualifications, units of competency have been audited, and then section 3 is your overall audit outcomes, so compliant, non-compliant, etc., etc. Then section 4 gives the auditor an opportunity to highlight any strengths that they might have found or opportunities for improvement. And then section 5, which is the bulk of the audit report, is the actual specific responses against the clauses that have been audited. And I'm sorry to say, at the moment, the TAC audit report, because it's being driven by IT requirements, is very long-winded. And when you get bored reading the audit report, just spare a thought for the poor auditors who've had to put in the information again and again and again. And they are working on it, so be patient with them. But yeah, the audit report is, the main body of the audit report is where you will find the information in regard to your non-compliances, and it will give you an outline of what the non-compliance is, and then it specify exactly what you need to do in general terms to address any of those non-compliances. As I say, unfortunately, IT issues have been driving the structure of that report. Okay, so if you are found to have been, your organisation is found to be non-compliant. Sorry, I've just gone over that again. There are levels of non-compliance. So something minor is often something that can be rectified almost straight away. And they are often documentation issues, or something that is easily addressed through continuous improvement. And generally, you'll have 20 working days to rectify any minor non-compliances. So, and minor non-compliance is usually for an organisation that is deemed to be generally providing good quality training and assessment. A significant non-compliance is usually something that impacts on the quality of the training and assessment being delivered. It's not a systemic issue. It's not just a process issue. It's something that can significantly affect the individual and the determination of the individual student's competency. So it's often to do with the amount of training or the assessment materials not meeting the requirements of clause 1.8, and they are impacting on the decisions that the RTO is making about their students. Again, you should have 20 days to rectify that. One of the things to remember, though, with any non-compliances around sort of training and assessment, excuse me. My apologies. Is that, say for example, your assessments are found to be non-compliant, and there perhaps you're not gathering sufficient evidence to allow the auditor to make an assessment judgment, and the auditor will then say specifically for a particular unit of competency, this assessment tool did not give sufficient detail in the checklist to gather the performance evidence, something along those lines. What you've got to remember is they may have only looked at 1 or 2 units of competency within your scope of registration, but you, as an organisation, are required to then go back and look at all your training and assessment and see that you're not making the same mistakes in other areas. The evidence you've got to submit for in terms of your rectification applies to the specific units that have been looked at audit. But you cannot rest on your laurels if you've updated one assessment tool for that particular unit of competency. you need to go back and look and make sure you're not doing the same thing again and again with other units. So it's really important that you remember that we might take a snapshot, but you are responsible for having everything that you do, particularly when it comes to training and assessment, being of the highest quality. There are critical non-compliances or even critical non-compliance with the risk of injury and death. TAC do have the opportunity to stop your training and assessment or to suspend some of your delivery, scope of delivery. Basically, it's a risk assessment and it doesn't happen very often. But, if there's something really, really concerning, they do, as the regulator, have the opportunity to do that. But 99% of the time, the non-compliances can be rectified in the 20-day period, and you will be given then an opportunity to demonstrate that you are compliant, and then your registration would be renewed or provided. So, as I say, in your audit handbook, or sorry, the supporting document that's been provided, you'll see a copy of the audit report. I'm not going to go through it. It's relatively straightforward, and it's got a few examples of how the audit findings and how what evidence was reviewed and what the non-compliances were. I think most of you will have had an opportunity by now to look at an audit report in the new format. If not, please do browse that document that has been provided. So, audit's been completed. Your organisation's perhaps been found non-compliant. You're given an opportunity to provide additional evidence, and you have that 20-day rectification period where you can address the non-compliances. Interestingly enough, ASCA has changed their approach on this a little bit as well. Because what they're finding is that often the rectification period led to still non-compliances, and then more rectification and more rectification. All that time, the RTOs weren't doing the right thing, and more students were being churned out who hadn't actually been trained and assessed properly. If you do provide evidence and there is still a non-compliance, then the organisation can impose sanctions. So one of the things they often do there is either go back and reassess the students that you've had already deemed to be competent, or they will not let you continue to deliver a certain part of your scope of your training and assessment. So, TAC does have that power to restrict what you're doing, or they can say to you, right, okay, you're just about there, we'll come back in 6 months and see how you're doing and make sure that you're actually implementing what you say you're going to implement. And that's why you would end up with something like a monitoring audit. There are people that can assist you with an audit outcome and give you some guidance on addressing the non-compliances that may have been found, but do be cautious about your selection of any consultants. There's some very good ones out there, and there's some really ugly ones out there. The good, bad, and very ugly. So be very, very careful. Auditors can't give you specific advice if they are following an audit that they've conducted. But they can give you general advice in terms of what good practices is out there. Some auditors for both TAC and ASCA are consultants, but again, when we talked about conflict of interest, this is something that you need to consider. If an auditor has conducted an audit of your organisation, it has to be a clear 6 months before they can give you any specific advice about your organisation. But that then does preclude them from conducting an audit for your organisation. But obviously, auditors do know their subjects pretty well, and as I say, be very cautious about your consultants that you engage. They're not all brilliant. Okay, so we've got about 9 minutes if there are any burning questions out there. Um, my if you I'm also willing to answer questions if you want to something specific and you want to give me a, a contact me through my email. I'm easily to find if you Google me. My work email comes up, so I'm happy to give you some advice if there's something very specific that you want to know about. But hopefully, this has given you a bit of an idea of what the audit process is about. And I think if there's anything I want you to take away from this, try and remember that an audit process should not be seen as an adversarial process. I would say the majority of the auditors from TAC go to the audits in order to assist you. They're not trying to catch you out. They're not trying to make your life difficult. They're not trying to make you so nervous that you can't think straight. That's not going to help us as auditors to get a really true picture of your organisation. So please take a deep breath. Be as organised as you can be. Take a systematic approach to the auditing process yourself so that you know what you want to get out of it and you also know that you are prepared, and that makes you feel more confident. Maria Jane, let me have a look. What if you have a qualification on your scope? You're coming up for re-registration, but you have not had a student enrolment in that qualification in 2 years, and you want to keep the qual on scope. Will the auditor just request to see the current tools and previous validation of student equivalence, qualifications, information, etc.? Student evidence, sorry, qualifications. Obviously, you can't provide what isn't there. If in that 2 years there has been a change in the currency of the qualification or the units of competency in that qualification, then you do need to demonstrate that you are ready. You've updated the documentation for that particular those particular units, or and the assessments and bits and pieces are up to date. They probably won't go back and look at the evidence from students that were more than 2 years, that were enrolled in more than 2 years ago. It doesn't really add any value. And to be honest, one of the other things when it comes to determining what the scope of the audit process will be, it often is the actual activity. The RTO activity will be taken into account. So generally speaking, at audit, we wouldn't really look at a qualification you haven't delivered for that length of time. And the reality is that there are quite a few instances where an RTO will have a qualification on scope, and they will never intend to deliver that qualification. They just want it on scope so that they've got the implicit scope of the units included in that qualification, and they are generally speaking only delivering the specific unit in that qualification and have no intention of delivering the full qual. And in that instance, it's about looking at your activity and saying, you've been delivering XYZ to 100 students. That's what we'll focus on. We're not interested in the fact that and expect to see evidence that you've got all the assessments and training materials for units that you'll never assess. So auditors do try to apply a bit of common sense. There is absolutely no point in trying to drag evidence out of something that's really not of any relevance to your organisation, or demonstrating whether you can deliver quality training and assessment. But as it's worth explaining that in your maybe a preamble when you submit your evidence, and say this is what our intention is, or make sure that your training and assessment strategy clearly identifies how you're going about things. Hope that answers your question. Okay. Good. Anybody else? You're being very quiet out there. So I hope I haven't bored you to tears. Just a reminder that, as I say, TAC are really, really great at providing documentation and information to support the RTOs that they regulate. Do go back and look at the fact sheets. They've been updated really recently, and there have been new ones added. They're really well explained. ASQA do provide fact sheets, etc., but I do find that they are not quite as clear as the fact sheets provided by TAC, and there are also the TAC guidelines to the standards, again a little bit more user friendly than maybe the ones provided by ASQA. So, you know, and there are also other, you will have access to free access to some of the other presentations by some of the other auditors who present for TAC. Okay, Jane is typing. I hope you didn't miss too much, Jane. That would have been, oh no, that was a different Jane, sorry. Yeah. But as I say, I'm more than happy if you want to contact me if you've got some specific questions on it's. I'm not allowed to put my actual contact details up on this particular presentation, but I'm easy to find. So, okay, thank you. I'm new to this and it was very enlightening. Good, thank you, Jane. I can catch up with the recording. Yeah, and I'm sorry about that. Unfortunately, we used to get a lot of support from the capability support group in DTWD, but they've been disbanded, and it's all a bit new to even the those of us that are presenters, because we're not really the technical experts here. I couldn't even get my own microphone to work just now. So anyway, so I hope you find it interesting, and I presume there'll be a few others that will be going back and listening to the recording and sharing that with others. All right. If you're happy, people are leaving the session, which makes sense. And if, all right, there's another, somebody else is typing. We'll wait for that. I'm happy to leave the chat box open for a little bit longer if you've got specific questions. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, good. Well, at least people, thanks so much for your response.